back here with question 4 from these essay questions. And in this one we are talking about the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the somatic nervous systems. There are 3 different nervous systems, or 2 I should say, that split up what happens in our body versus what we can control in our body. What we can control and what is intentional is the somatic nervous system. What we don't control and what just happens regularly without us really noticing it is the autonomic nervous system, which is split up into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Our first section that we're looking at is the parasympathetic and comparing that with the sympathetic. Our parasympathetic nervous system has to do with being relaxed and what's called rest and digest. It increases a decreased heart rate, lower blood pressure and lower respiration, constriction of the pupils, and increased secretions and peristalsis of the digestive tract, and increased urination. With those things, it's our body telling us we're okay, everything's working as normally, digest the food, we don't have to be on the run. Whereas our sympathetic does the opposite. It is our fight or flight, and it leads to an increased heart rate and blood pressure, sometimes goosebumps, pupil dilation to let more light in, let us notice more things as we're running from predators, bronchial dilation so that we can get better air into our body without, it makes us more effective, more efficient with our breathing, and increased blood flow to our cardiac and skeletal muscles. We can run fast, get away from the saber-toothed tiger, so on and so forth. Our somatic nervous system is what we can control. I want to flex my arm, flex my biceps, I can, because of my somatic nervous system. It's our voluntary control of our body movements, and it uses our skeletal muscles to do so. Looking at our next part, we're looking at our CNS, or our central nervous system origin, where it comes from. With our parasympathetic, that comes from our medial medullary sites inside of our brain, and it moves down to where we need them. There's 2 neurons in each pathway as we move away from the brain to where we need them. And where we need them typically is within our organs. You know, if we're resting and digesting with our parasympathetic nervous system, then we need our ganglia, or our receivers, near those organs, like our stomach. So our ganglia are near those target organs. The neuroreceptor, or the neurotransmitter, that we're typically looking at with our parasympathetic is acetylcholine, very common, and our receptors for that acetylcholine is M1 through M5, so M2, M3, M4, and M5. Those are our receptors on the end of our axons or neurons, sending those signals down to the body. Looking at our sympathetic nervous system, we have origin from the central nervous system on the thoracolumbar region of our spinal cord, so kind of in the middle, just at the ribs, down our lower back. That's where they come out of. That's where our nervous system will link up to our brain in that region. It also has a pathway of 2 neurons, as I understand. 2 neurons will pass the signals to and from, and it has ganglia just outside of our spinal cord, which it will eventually meet up with where we need it, such as inside of our heart, or telling our brain to constrict the blood vessels, so on and so forth. Ganglia is just outside of the spinal cord. The neurotransmitters are acetylcholine and some norepinephrine. Norepinephrine. I think I said that right. Those are our neurotransmitters that we see, and our receptors for our sympathetic nervous system is A1, A2, B1, A2, and B3. Those are our receptors that we see inside of our sympathetic nervous system. With our somatic nervous system, our voluntary control, our linkage point, or our origin with the central nervous system, is the motor cortex, and it's both the premotor and the primary motor cortex inside of our brains. I can tell myself to flex, and it happens. It's inside of my brain because I am thinking it. Now, something interesting is that sometimes we can take over the parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous systems with our somatic nervous systems. Don't believe me? You are now breathing manually. Breathe manually. Boom. You're doing it. Because you're thinking about it. It lets our somatic nervous system take over when we need it to. That doesn't mean I can constrict or dilate my blood vessels at will, but it does happen as I flex my muscles. As I do so, it increases my blood pressure by constricting my blood vessels within my arm. Right now, my blood pressure is increased because of this. I am flexing, I'm doing that, I'm thinking it, I'm controlling my sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Typically, our ganglia is within the muscles or body systems that we want to use. Ganglia for the legs, ganglia for the arms, within our brachial plexus and so forth. Can't remember the one for the legs, sorry. Our neurotransmitter is typically acetylcholine as well inside of this nervous system. Next, we're talking about the our different receptors that we have. I always struggle with this. Cholinergic. I'm going with it. I practiced before, it didn't work. Cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. These are two receptors that receive different transmitters and do different things, obviously. Within our cholinergic receptors, there are two subsets of receptors. One is called nicotinic, and the other one is muscarinic receptors, and these are both affected by nicotine from tobacco and muscarine. I think that's what it's called, muscarine from types of mushrooms. I'm not totally certain about what these receptors do. There wasn't a lot about them inside of our reading. If there was, I just need to go back and read it again. But those are the two different type of cholinergic receptors within our bodies. Nicotine specifically activates nicotinic, and muscarine activates muscarinic receptors. And then as well, acetylcholine activates both types of those receptors as well. With our adrenergic, I feel like someone is telling me I'm saying it wrong in their head or out loud. Adrenergic receptors, epinephrine, I can't speak, epinephrine, I'm not editing this. This is raw footage. Epinephrine. Epinephrine is typically our transmitter that we see going into those receptors. There are different subtypes with our adrenergic receptors. There's alpha 1 and alpha 2, as well as beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Those are different receptors that we see with the adrenergic receptors. Next, we're looking at our mechanisms for each type of receptor, because as we receive those signals, as we have our receptors get those neurotransmitters, they will do different things. So within our eyes, typically, we will see a use of the intrinsic muscles. Either the size of the pupil will dilate or constrict, letting in more light or less light, depending on what is being affected within our sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous systems, as well as the lens shape, which is interesting. Same with our secretory epithelium, which allows more water or less water into our eyes. I can only assume it affects the image that we're receiving by bending the lens or straightening it out as more water enters or leaves the cells of our eyes. Sorry. Next is our blood vessels, and the mechanism of action that we see is vasoconstriction and vasodilation. As our blood pressure rises because we're running from a predator and our sympathetic nervous system is telling us that we're going to die and we need to run away from the saber-toothed tiger, we will see those blood vessels constrict, and that is the mechanism of that. Sweat glands is also one. As we're nervous, as our sympathetic nervous system takes over, it will cause us to sweat. release more liquid to cool us down. Our next one is the heart, and there is an increase or decrease of our heart rate, as well as the force of contraction that we see within the heart. If we're nervous, it starts beating more and more. If you're really nervous, you can really feel it pounding in your chest. Force of contraction will change within our hearts. The next one is the lungs and fish tank. The constriction and dilation of our bronchial passageways will happen as we are relaxed or nervous and running away from the ever common saber-toothed tigers within our worlds. And the next one is the stomach and intestines. As we are calmer and we let our parasympathetic nervous system run and we rest and digest, we'll see an increased secretion of those fluids and bile that we need to digest our food, as well as a relaxation or constriction of our sphincters within our intestines. And that is all of the mechanisms that I really care to share at this moment. I feel like it was enough. If it's not, I'm sure it'll be reflected in my grade, but I hope it's enough. Those are all of our questions that we have for the essay questions. I hope you found my answers to be satisfactory. If not, I'm sorry. If you don't like my editing job, I'm not doing one. Raw footage. Have a good one.